Public policy is essentially how a government addresses the needs of the people. It's the concrete set of rules, actions, and programs that shape our daily lives. Think of public policy as the government's playbook, how it allocates resources, delivers services, and responds to issues that affect the collective good. Whether it's clean air regulations, public education, or infrastructure, policy decisions determine who gets what, when, and how. And we're all currently living through real-world public policy dilemmas. Should the federal government cancel student debt? Should there be a national ban on assault weapons? Should healthcare be a universal right funded through higher taxes? Should climate change policy prioritize rapid decarbonization, even if it disrupts jobs in traditional industries? Should social media companies be regulated like public utilities to curb misinformation? For each of these issues, you should ask yourself, who decides whether this is even a real problem? How do we agree on solutions? How much should we spend on them? Who are the stakeholders in these fights, and do they have political power to shape the outcome? How has hyperpartisanship warped the conversation and narrowed the path toward compromise? Ultimately, we have to interrogate how public policy is made, who benefits, and who's left out. Public policy problems are rarely straightforward. What counts as a public problem isn't always obvious. One person's crisis might be another's political talking point. Even when we agree that something needs fixing, deciding on a solution isn't simple. It costs money, and someone's going to scream about that. Choosing to spend on one policy often means taking resources from somewhere else. That trade-off sparks fierce battles. Who gets to declare that a policy issue exists in the first place? Who decides the urgency, the scale of government involvement, and where funding should come from? Every policy choice produces winners and losers, and stakeholders with political power have a louder voice in these debates. Hyperpartisanship turns this balancing act into trench warfare, where compromise feels like betrayal and solving real problems becomes secondary to scoring political victories. Public policy exists to manage the constant push and pull of competing needs in a society that never has enough resources to make everyone happy. At its best, public policy resolves conflicts over who gets what. It regulates behavior so people can coexist without chaos, and motivates collective action when individual efforts fall short. When a new policy is proposed, is it really addressing conflict over scarce resources, or is it just moving the fight somewhere else? Are regulations genuinely about fairness and safety, or about protecting certain interests? And when leaders talk about inspiring collective action, are they empowering communities or just using rhetoric to consolidate political power? Understanding these purposes helps us see whether public policy is working for the public good or serving narrow agendas. Public policies come in different forms, each with its own political battles and consequences. Redistributive policies shift resources from those with more to those with less, often sparking accusations of unfairness or handouts. Distributive policies spread benefits broadly, like infrastructure, public schools. But even then, Some groups still manage to carve out larger pieces of the pie. Regulatory policies set rules and restrictions, aiming to keep society safe and fair, though critics paint them as suffocating red tape. When policymakers choose one type of policy over another, they decide who benefits and who loses. Are redistributive efforts truly leveling the playing field or just fueling political backlash? Do distributive policies genuinely serve everyone equally, or do the well-connected quietly take more? And are regulations about protecting the public or protecting entrenched interests? Seeing the types of policy clearly is the first step in understanding how power is exercised and contested in government. Redistributive policies aim to take resources from those with more and channel them to those with less. These policies often appear as progressive taxes or welfare programs like SNAP benefits and Medicaid. The principle is rooted in fairness and opportunity, ensuring that basic needs like education and healthcare aren't determined solely by wealth. But passing and implementing redistributive policies is notoriously difficult. Wealthier groups have the means to fight them through lobbying, campaigns, and litigation. Social stigma also lingers, branding these programs as government handouts rather than essential support for leveling the field. This friction makes redistributive policies some of the most politically contentious measures in modern governance.
Well, Pop, that's what the welfare thing is set up for people in financial trouble. Now, what do you think we pay taxes for? We'd just be taking advantage of something that was set up for people like us.
What's that mean, people like us?
Well, you know, poor people, the have-nots.
The have-nots? Well, if the have-nots could get something from the haves, say the haves gave the have-nots half of what they have, then the haves would still be the haves, but the have-nots would be the have-somethings.
Stop.
I ran a little experiment and broke down federal spending from 2024 into a single dollar. This chart shows exactly what redistributive policies cost in practice. For every dollar spent, about 27 cents goes to health insurance programs like Medicare, Medicaid, ACA subsidies. Programs designed to fight poverty make up about 5 cents of every federal dollar, with specific initiatives like SNAP and WIC receiving even smaller shares. We'll return to this chart throughout this video to understand how policies fit into the broader picture of public spending. Distributive policies are government actions that provide benefits broadly across society, not just targeted to the poor or to the wealthy. Think of infrastructure programs and projects like highways and bridges and public schools or national parks. These policies are often seen as universally beneficial because everyone uses the service. However, just because the benefits are spread out doesn't mean they're equally shared. Some regions or groups often get more investment than others. Funded by taxes paid by all, distributive programs fill gaps that private markets can't profitably address. These projects help knit the country together by providing essential goods and services that individuals or businesses alone wouldn't or couldn't supply. Distributive policies still spark debates over fairness, efficiency, And who really reaps the greatest rewards? Subsidies are a distinct type of distributive policy where the government provides financial support to specific industries or sectors, often to encourage production, stabilize prices, or ensure access to essential goods. Common examples include subsidies for farmers to keep food prices low or for energy companies to boost renewable energy development. Although these programs are funded by taxpayers broadly, the direct benefits usually flow to targeted businesses or industries. This makes subsidies less visible to the average citizen, even though they indirectly benefit consumers through lower prices or improved access to services. Because of this hidden nature, subsidies contribute to what political scientists call the submerged state, where government help is quietly embedded in market systems rather than directly handed to individuals. While subsidies are meant to help sectors thrive, they also raise questions about fairness, market distortion, and which industries deserve long-term government support.
The U.S. has just about 90 million acres of this viral kid's absolute favorite food.
Corn.
What do you like about corn?
There's a reason people call it yellow gold. 2021's corn crop was worth over $86 billion.
According to the USDA, the U.S. is the largest consumer, producer, and exporter of corn in the world.
I mean, look at this chart of U.S. grain crops. And that's because
we're really good at it. And that's why you see big acres, big demand, export competitiveness. We're good at it.
It's not just what we eat, it's in what we buy and how we fuel up.
We've kind of turbocharged the value of corn through the application of science.
Corn is just getting more and more useful, which is causing not just the U.S. economy to rely on this grain, but also the rest of the world. At $2.2 billion in 2019, corn is the most heavily subsidized of all.
Do we get the corn acres because we've got the support, or do we have the support because we have the corn acres?
Here's how the United States became a corn powerhouse. There's sweet corn at barbecues or even your popcorn.
And then there's this corn. This corn is the majority of what's grown in the U.S.
Field corn is 99% of what you see when you drive down the road. The other 1% is sweet corn or edible corn. Corn is certainly used in many, many more ways than it was, say, in the 1950s and 60s.
A lot of the corn that's grown in the U.S. and traditionally was grown in the U.S. to be fed to livestock.
Animal feed accounts for about 40% of total domestic corn use. So even if you're not eating corn directly, it's being fed to the meat that Americans consume. Corn is milled by either a wet or dry process. So it's transformed into syrups and starches that also end up as ingredients in other processed foods people eat every day. Think high fructose corn syrup, corn oil, cereal, corn flour, corn grits, cornmeal, and much more.
A lot of corn is now going into biofuel production, specifically ethanol.
Just about every gallon of gasoline in the US contains up to 10% ethanol. Doing the math, in 2019, ethanol contributed more than $43 billion to the US GDP, and it added $23.3 billion to household income. All of this created over $10 billion in tax revenue that year.
These demands have kind of grown along with our really productive corn crops in the United States.
The U.S. wasn't always a corn superpower. which it is. We have the soils and climate on a wide scale, particularly in the U.S. Midwest.
A lot of this corn is grown here, which is why it's called the Corn Belt.
So I'm Seth Meyer. I'm USDA's chief economist. I'm an Iowan, if that helps with my authority on corn. U.S. producers just continue to show an upward trend of how many bushels they can get per acre.
There was a revolution in corn production after World War II.
As a weapon for our defense.
We can thank science and the private sector's plant breeding and genetics investments.
Filled with corn.
The overall number of farms growing feed grains like corn is declining, but the acreage dedicated to growing corn on those farms is growing.
At the same time, the amount of large corn farms has increased over time, outnumbering the amount of small corn farms in operation.
This is all to say that corn is big business, really big business, thanks to advances in seeds, fertilizers, and production practices.
These charts show how much corn crops in the U.S. are now producing. So even with more land dedicated to corn, the plant itself is yielding more of a harvest. And these charts show that the more corn the U.S. produces, the more valuable it gets. And that's just because supply is following demand. And demand is growing, not just from fuel and food in the U.S. The U.S. also exports a ton of corn.
The world also uses corn as a feed grain, and so we export to many countries.
Every year, an average of 15% of U.S. produced corn is exported, and that includes value-added products like ethanol.
Overall, corn production has increased. So U.S. was the major exporter of wheat for many, many years. Wheat production has fallen off largely because corn and soybeans are far more profitable to grow for farmers.
Farmers have to consider a lot of different variables when it comes to what might impact their crops.
Is this year a better year to plant more corn or soybeans? What's going to be the impact of higher nitrogen prices? What about these new conservation programs in the new Farm Bill? What about carbon markets?
They live in somewhat of an environment of uncertainty. So producers are constantly looking at, what's my risks? What do I think prices will be?
Corn is too important for farmers, the U.S. economy, and world hunger to be left entirely to chance. So the government ensures the value through subsidies.
But corn is the primary beneficiary of the crop insurance program. There are subsidies for insurance. So crop insurance typically account for about 4 to 5% of the value of corn production.
It's more designed to be a safety net that says, okay, this isn't going to save you if you consistently have high costs or consistently are less productive. This isn't going to save you, but it will help you if there's a big adverse event.
For example, the 2022 October forecast for U.S. feed grain production, which is dominated by corn, is down 1 million tons due to summer drought conditions across the center of the country.
The programs started as a response to the depths of the Great Depression.
Subsidies will cost the nation nearly $1 billion
where literally people were starving. Particularly after World War II, there was a great debate, well, we're not in the Great Depression anymore. Can't we just get rid of these programs? And that's kind of been the theme ever since.
There's two dominant avenues for subsidies: crop insurance and income support programs.
Essentially, farmers have a choice to take one or the other, and they're both income programs that one's triggered on prices. So if prices go below a certain level, then they're eligible for a payment on those historical acres that they are based on what you historically grew, not what you currently grow. So you can grow soybeans but still receive a corn payment. That's something called the Price Loss Coverage Program, or PLC. And then the other one is called the Agricultural Risk Coverage, and that's based on revenue. So if the calculated revenue this year for your farm is less than the guarantee that's provided by the program, you'll get a payment. Over the last 5 years, the average payment was roughly $13 per acre. And in many years, they were zero. Like this current year, there's no money going to corn producers because prices are so high and revenues are so high, they're not triggering payments.
According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal crop insurance program's net spending will increase to nearly $40 billion from 2021 through 2025. At the same time, farmland values have reached all-time record highs. This isn't to say that farmland values are reaching these highs because of increased subsidies. This is correlation, not causation.
The value of that land is intimately connected to the value of corn.
A lot of these subsidies, they do get embedded into the cost of farmland, essentially bid up the price of farmland marginally. And so the benefits accrue largely to those who own land, and we'll probably see farmland's value inflated just a little bit because of these subsidies. Price of land is so expensive, it's very hard to be a new farmer when, land is going for $15,000 an acre.
While these insurance programs provide key financial safety for farmers, Congress may revisit how to improve these policies and programs to make them more efficient and equitable. If subsidies are baked into the cost of the land, removing that money from the equation could throw off the debt-to-asset ratio of some farms.
Farmland values that are connected to the programs, but it's the debt obligations that have been incurred based on the expectation that assets will be supported by the farm programs. Right now, I don't think it would happen, but you can make an argument that if you made the sector go cold turkey, you would certainly raise the specter of a financial crisis because asset values would fall, debt obligations don't change.
Just like the average U.S. consumer, inflation is a top concern for farmers.
In combating changing climates while rethinking how some subsidies are utilized is a big factor when considering how to move forward.
Temperature changes and climate changes, we're going to need to have adaptation.
There are possibilities to take subsidies and repurpose them in more directed, targeted ways to reduce nitrogen runoff or to address certain climate issues and things like that. There's a report called the $1 Billion Opportunity, which looked at removal of subsidies and what effects they would have.
Out of the worldwide nearly $540 billion spent a year on agricultural support, the report found that at least 87% of that money supports measures that are often inefficient, inequitable, distort food prices, hurt people's health, and degrade the environment. However, the report found if those subsidies were removed altogether,
the effects were pretty small. And that's not saying that that's not a good reason to get rid of subsidies, because I think if you look at some of the impacts on, say, on greenhouse gas emissions for things like livestock production, they had a pretty big impact.
So repurposing the programs, rather than getting rid of support altogether, could be more effective, according to the United Nations Environment Program.
Say, how do we kind of put some stability or the safety net under this program, and how do we do it in a sustainable way? So I think that that's going to be the challenges going forward, and it's in the middle of an environment where lots of folks are concerned about climate.
And then the other big issue is how do you do it in a way that ensures that there's compliance?
The report outlines 6 steps for rethinking and repurposing subsidies. Estimate the existing support, figure out the impact of that support, design a new approach based on needed reforms, estimate the future impact of a new repurposing strategy, review and refine the strategy before it's implemented, monitor the outcomes of the new agricultural producer support.
The administration right now is pushing a lot of so-called climate smart agricultural practices. But the trick is, how do you do it in a way that you achieve true additionality? That is, you really do reduce carbon, and you aren't just rewarding farmers for things they might do anyway.
Subsidies can be hard to spot because they often don't show up as direct payments to individuals. Instead, they're financial supports for businesses or industries designed to make goods cheaper or more available. For example, subsidies can keep food prices stable, encourage renewable energy, or help airlines stay afloat during economic downturns. Political scientist Suzanne Mettler describes this hidden assistance as the submerged state, Government aid is embedded within tax breaks, subsidies, and employer benefits, making it largely invisible to most Americans. As a result, many people believe they're not receiving government help at all, even when they personally benefit from subsidized health care, housing, or food. This invisibility has real political consequences because voters may actively support cutting or eliminating these programs without realizing that doing so would harm them directly. Understanding the submerged state helps explain why subsidies are politically tricky. They influence daily life profoundly, yet remain unseen in ways that distort public perception of government's role in the economy. Regulatory policies are the rules and standards government sets to shape behavior, protect citizens, and ensure fairness in the marketplace. These can range from environmental protections and workplace safety regulations to consumer safeguards in food and medicine. At their core, regulatory policies are about setting boundaries that individuals and businesses must follow to keep society safe, healthy, and functioning. Supporters argue that regulation prevents exploitation and catastrophic harm, like ensuring factories don't pollute drinking water or financial institutions don't gamble away people's life savings. Critics, however, see regulations as overreach, red tape that stifles innovation and slows economic growth and burdens businesses. Despite this tension, regulations are woven deeply into modern life. Without them, we wouldn't have the same standards for product safety, clean air, or fair labor practices. Understanding regulatory policy means recognizing it as a balancing act between freedom and protection, individual enterprise, and collective responsibility.
New York's soda ban was struck down, but should it have been? Anthony here for D News, and this week, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg's controversial soda ban proposal was struck down by a court ruling. The idea was that large-sized sugary drinks like sodas are a major cause of obesity and health issues, so he wanted to remove them from New York stores and only offer smaller sizes. Sounds legit. Of course, so does the other side of the argument, which is you're not my real dad. See, people speaking out against the soda ban think that if people want to have a big old soda, they should be able to have one. And it's not the soda, it's the people who don't control themselves that are causing the health issues. I mean, what's to stop those people from just buying 2 small-sized drinks and downing them at once? The court apparently felt the same way, calling the ban arbitrary and capricious, with the judge saying that the Board of Health can't stop something from being sold unless there is a clear health risk associated with it. And we are talking along the lines of causing diseases, not just being bad for you. But would a ban actually help? Well, here's a fun fact. Sugary drinks are the biggest source of calories in the average American's diet. They account for about 7% of the calories people take in every day. And since the 1970s, Americans have doubled their consumption of sugary drinks. You know what else has doubled? The obesity rate. Now, that doesn't mean that they're related. Correlation, causation, something, something. But a study of the top 10 most obese neighborhoods in New York were also the ones that drank the most soda. And yeah, there's evidence that people tend to eat more if they're given a larger portion, even if they're not hungry. A professor of psychology at Yale also said that liquid calories don't register the same way in your brain that calories from food do. So you drink more of a larger drink without feeling full, even though you'd probably be just as satisfied with a smaller one. But you know, there are bigger problems with the ban. Yes, dropping the size of sodas from 20 ounces to 16 ounces might get people drinking less of it, but what about all those other sugary drinks out there? Under the ban, you could still order a milkshake. You could still order those sugar-filled drinks that label themselves as juice. You know, when you look at it, it's orange juice drink. Those were not affected. The ban also wouldn't apply to convenience stores or grocery stores, just restaurants and cafes. So how does that stop anything. It feels like instead of spending all this time and money and energy setting up a limited ban, Bloomberg would have been better off pushing for better education about diet and nutrition in schools and in programs throughout the city. I mean, if people don't understand how much damage they're doing to themselves, trying to take something away from them will just make them defensive. But if they know how bad it is for them, maybe they'll stop on their own. How do you guys feel about the ban? And how much soda do you drink? Be honest. I am not into it, but my blood is probably 70% coffee and ice cream. So let me know and subscribe for more D News.
Within the world of regulatory policy, there's a subtler approach known as nudging. Nudges are small, intentional tweaks in how choices are presented to people, designed to influence behavior without outright restricting options. Nudges can take many forms. A mindful nudge might be a screen time alert reminding you to take a break. A mindless nudge could be how grocery stores place candy near the checkout, prompting impulse buys. Guilty. Encouraging nudges, like loyalty programs, gently push people towards desired actions. Discouraging nudges, such as graphic cigarette warnings, steer people away from harmful behaviors. These policies operate in the background of everyday life, quietly shaping choices. Unlike traditional regulations, nudges preserve freedom of choice while still achieving policy goals, making them a powerful, often overlooked tool. Domestic policy is where government action most visibly intersects with everyday American life. It's a broad category covering nearly every aspect of society. Economic policies that manage taxes, minimum wage, inflation, public debt. Education policies that set curriculum standards and ensure student financial aid. And health policies that shape access to public health services, mental health resources, and insurance coverage. It also includes energy policies determining how we fuel our economy, social welfare programs like Social Security and unemployment benefits, environmental policies to combat pollution and climate change, and criminal justice reforms addressing police and prison systems. Even the infrastructure we rely on, roads, bridges, public transit, water supply, and broadband internet, falls under domestic policy. These policies define the social contract between citizens and their government, what government promises to provide, how it expects people to contribute, and how both sides share in the responsibilities and benefits of modern society. Means-tested programs are designed to direct government aid to those who need it most, typically based on income or other qualifying factors. These programs act like a selective entry system. Only those who meet specific criteria can access benefits, such as Medicaid, food stamps, SNAP benefits, or housing assistance. The advantage of means-tested programs is that they target limited resources toward vulnerable populations. However, these programs can be complex to navigate, creating administrative hurdles that actually discourage people from applying. They can also carry a social stigma that makes recipients feel singled out or shamed, despite the programs existing to provide essential support. Means-tested aid is often at the center of political debates over fairness, dependency, and the size of government, making it one of the most contested elements of domestic policy. Entitlement programs operate differently from means-tested aid. Instead of requiring people to prove financial hardship, these programs provide benefits to anyone who meets specific eligibility requirements, such as age or work history. Social Security and Medicare are the clearest examples. You pay into the system during your working years and become entitled to benefits later in life. Pay now, take later. Because eligibility is based on contributions or meeting defined criteria, entitlement programs carry less stigma than means-tested programs. They're often viewed as earned rights rather than government handouts. However, they're also expensive to maintain as the population ages and more people qualify for benefits. Entitlement programs form a cornerstone of the American social safety net, providing critical stability for retirees, the disabled, and others who have met the program's thresholds.
The reason that Social Security faces a long-term financing shortfall is the aging of the population.
In other words, boomers. Here's a chart of the US population. As you can see, there's a bump here. That's the baby boomer generation. For decades, this giant population was the main workforce that paid into Social Security. That means more people were putting money in than taking money out. So those trust funds that we talked about earlier had a surplus, and the US Treasury took that extra money and invested it. And those investments ultimately gave us a $2.9 trillion reserve. Then came 2021. At this point, Social Security stopped operating in a surplus and actually fell into a deficit because more and more people started to collect.
We just don't have quite as many workers supporting each beneficiary as we used to.
Taxes are the engine that funds public policy, and understanding how they work reveals a lot about the priorities of American government. Broadly speaking, taxes fall into two categories: regressive and progressive. Regressive taxes take a larger percentage of income from low and middle income earners than from the wealthy. Sales taxes, tariffs on goods imported from other countries, payroll taxes that cap contributions at certain income, and property taxes can all be regressive because they apply the same rate regardless of ability to pay. This means that lower income households spend a greater share of their earnings on taxes than wealthier households. Progressive taxes, on the other hand, are designed so that the tax rate increases as income rises. Federal income taxes are structured in brackets, meaning high earners pay a larger share. Estate taxes and capital gains taxes on significant investment profits also ensure that those with substantial wealth contribute more proportionally. In Texas, the tax system is overwhelmingly regressive. Property taxes and sales taxes hit middle and working class families hardest, while the state's constitutional ban on income taxes shields its wealthiest residents. Meanwhile, homeowners and renters are told by policymakers that property taxes fund strong public schools, boost property values, and ensure quality education. Regressive taxes like these are not unique to Texas. Across the nation, payroll taxes remain flat. Excise taxes on goods like tobacco and gasoline disproportionately impact lower income households, and toll roads pile costs on commuters. Meanwhile, progressive income taxes have been demonized and stripped away, locking in a system that benefits corporations and the wealthy elite. Progressive taxation was introduced in 1913 to offset the regressivity of tariffs and to fight inequality in the Gilded Age. But global pressures and corporate tax cuts since the 2010s have eroded that balance. The result is what many call tax injustice, a system where the winners of globalization escape taxation while working families shoulder the heaviest burdens. Foreign policy is the official approach the United States takes to manage its relationships with other countries and international actors. It's about solving problems and advancing national interests beyond our borders. This includes diplomacy, where the U.S. negotiates trade agreements, peace treaties, and collaborates on global challenges like climate change. National security is another pillar, encompassing military alliances, counterterrorism strategies, and arms control agreements. Trade policy shapes economic relations with other nations, from negotiating tariffs to implementing sanctions. International law provides the framework for treaties, maritime rules, and guidelines on the use of force. Foreign aid and development programs help build alliances, promote stability, and project American values abroad. While foreign policy might seem distant from daily life, it directly impacts economic conditions, security, and even domestic politics. Understanding foreign policy is crucial for grasping how the U.S. positions itself on the world stage and balances cooperation with competition. Foreign policy is how the United States navigates the international stage, and it consists of several interconnected tools and strategies. Diplomacy involves foreign negotiations and relationships with other countries. This includes trade agreements, peace treaties, and global cooperation on transnational issues like climate change. Diplomacy is considered a form of soft power, the ability to shape outcomes through persuasion, relationships, and influence rather than force. National security refers to the military and strategic side of foreign policy. It includes forming military alliances, managing arms control agreements, and developing plans to counter terrorism and other global threats. These are examples of hard power, where military strength and the threat of force are used to secure national interests. Trade policy shapes our economic relationships with other countries. It covers the negotiation of trade agreements and the use of economic sanctions to influence behavior abroad. Trade can operate as both hard and soft power. Sanctions can coerce, while fair trade agreements can build cooperative bonds. International law consists of treaties, maritime regulations, and rules governing the use of force. It sets the legal framework that nations can expect to follow, often upheld through soft power mechanisms like international courts or diplomatic pressure rather than direct military action. Aid and development is about providing resources to developing nations, either to support humanitarian needs or to foster diplomatic goodwill. Aid is a classic example of soft power, where assistance builds alliances and enhances U.S. influence without coercion. Together, these components and the balance between soft and hard power shape how the U.S. asserts power, promotes its interests, and engages with the world in a constantly shifting global landscape. American foreign policy has always wrestled with a tension between global engagement and nationalist isolationism. And this tension has often played out as a struggle between presidential power and congressional authority. After the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson championed the League of Nations as a step towards a cooperative global order, but Congress rejected it, reflecting both isolationist sentiment and congressional resistance to ceding foreign policy control to the executive branch. The 1920s and 30s became defined by isolationism, with Congress often constraining presidential efforts to engage internationally. The Second World War dramatically shifted this stance. Presidential leadership under Franklin Delano Roosevelt pulled the U.S. into interventionism, leading the Allies to victory and shaping post-war institutions like the United Nations and NATO. This era marked a strong assertion of presidential authority in foreign policy, positioning the U.S. as a global leader in maintaining international order. The 9/11 attacks sparked a new era of neoconservatism, characterized by expansive presidential power to launch military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq without formal declarations of war. These actions triggered ongoing debates about congressional oversight and the limits of executive authority in using hard power to reshape global regions. Today, U.S. foreign policy faces another crossroads, navigating globalization and a rules-based international order versus rising nationalist and isolationist movements that argue for withdrawing from global commitments. These debates continue to highlight the push and pull between presidents who act decisively on the world stage and a Congress that struggles to assert its constitutional role in shaping foreign policy. Public policy doesn't emerge from a single branch of government, shaped by a complex network of actors, each influencing the outcome in distinct ways. Congress drafts and passes legislation, controlling the purse strings and representing diverse constituencies. The president leads on setting national priorities and can act unilaterally in certain areas, especially foreign policy. The courts interpret laws and can strike down policies they deem unconstitutional, shaping what is permissible. Bureaucratic agencies implement and enforce policies, often filling in gaps left by legislation. Interest groups lobby and mobilize public opinion to steer policy in directions favorable to their causes. The media frames political debates, elevating some issues while ignoring others, and ultimately the public, through elections, protests, and civic engagement, pushes leaders towards certain actions or away from others. Power among these players is constantly contested. Presidents may try to bypass Congress through executive orders. Congress may try to push back with investigations or funding cuts. Courts may check both branches, and public pressure can disrupt the entire policy process. Policy emerges not from one source, but from the friction and negotiation among all these forces. Public policy is the product of a deliberate and often contentious process. It unfolds in 5 major stages. Agenda setting is where issues first gain attention, whether through media coverage, advocacy campaigns, or crises. Certain problems rise to the top of the public and political radar, while others remain in the background. Policy formation follows that. This is where lawmakers, experts, and stakeholders brainstorm possible solutions. Competing ideas and interests clash as draft proposals are shaped, debated, and revised. Policy adoption occurs when one solution is chosen and officially authorized, often through legislation or executive action. This is the turning point where ideas become concrete commitments. Policy implementation puts these commitments into action. Bureaucratic agencies design programs, enforce rules, and oversee the rollout of the adopted policy, turning theory into practice. Policy evaluation comes last, assessing whether the policy is effective, equitable, and sustainable. Policymakers use these findings to tweak or overhaul policies, feeding lessons learned back into the system. This process is a constant negotiation shaped by political battles, shaped by public pressure, and shifting priorities. Public policy is about laws and regulations. It's about power, conflict, and choices that shape our society. From redistributive programs to regulatory frameworks, domestic welfare to foreign policy, every decision reflects a struggle over resources, values, and visions for the future. The policymaking process is a cycle of debate, compromise, and revision driven by multiple actors with competing interests. We've seen how taxes define fairness and inequality, how subsidies and entitlements hide or reveal government's hand, and how foreign policy balances hard and soft power. We've traced historical tensions between presidential authority and congressional oversight, and examined how public opinion, media, and interest groups can steer or stall change. Ultimately, understanding public policy means interrogating who holds power, who benefits, and who is left out. In a democracy, this understanding gives us the ability and responsibility to challenge, demand, and shape policies that truly serve the public good. Always question the narratives, scrutinize the trade-offs, and push for policies that match your vision of fairness and justice. Real change begins when informed citizens refuse to accept the status quo and insist on a government that works for everyone.